When it comes to map design, there are a lot of different attributes to talk about, but I think one thing that everyone likes is stage gimmicks. Having something to spice up and provide a little bit of an identity to a level was something really common in Splatoon 1, and that trend has sort of come back toward the tail end of Splatoon 3's maps. So today I figure, why not go through and take a look at all 15 stage gimmicks and rank them from worst to best. Before we get started, quick disclaimers. First off, I'm not counting shifty stations. If you guys want these, let me know and they'll have to be their own video, because there's a lot of them. And 2, I'm going to be rating the gimmicks based off of the gimmick itself, trying to detach the actual stage they're on as much as possible from its identity. And 3, I'm not going to be counting any gimmicks that are just the way the stage is laid out. So for example, Ramen's Trench, Camp and Bluefin Split Middle, Flounder Heights and Moray Towers Verticality, or Reef's Bridge are not going to count as gimmicks, even though some of them very clearly define the stages they play on. Alright, with the ground rules out of the way, let's get started. The worst gimmick of all time is the Wahoo World Timer. This is probably the most infamous gimmick that will ever exist, because sometime in 2020, Mecha made a tweet pointing out how there's this little indicator about when the bridge actually goes up and down, saying, wait, this is a timer, which exploded due to people either not knowing that it was a timer, or being completely shocked how anyone could miss this as a timer. By the way, there's a second one over here. Anyway, reputation aside, the gimmick of the actual timer itself is basically just retracting a walkway, or removing a route from the stage. I don't think I need to explain too much why this isn't very liked. In Wahoo World, this is literally the main way to get into the middle of the map, but even if it wasn't, I don't think there's ever a time I would go, yeah, I wish that route would go away for half the game. Number 14, rotational symmetry. So every Splatoon game has had one stage, Salt Spray for Splatoon 1, Skipper for Splatoon 2, and Lemuria for Splatoon 3, that is rotationally flipped instead of the way it's normally flipped. Which basically just means one side is going to have a small but noticeable right peak advantage, and generally the stages will feel like you're fighting a lot more from left to right, rather than top to bottom, which can create some interesting layouts, but so far it hasn't led to anything exceptional yet, which means I don't really have a lot of props to give it right now. Number 13, the glass on Schellendorf Institute. This has a very close comparison with something else later down this list, and while it has some unique moments, I think the glass for the most part just kind of feels oppressive or annoying to move on. You can't shoot from underneath the glass as easily, which can make it difficult to deal with, and it's just kind of awkward to move on. There is some merit to having a lot of the stage taken up by something that hinders your movement options to some degree, but I don't think this was done particularly well. Number 12, the elevators from both Salt Spray Rig and Bluefin. Technically, these are slightly different from each other, but not enough to where I think they should be separate points on the list. Salt Spray Rig has the worst version of the two, which is just an elevated platform that moves up and down on a set rotation, where the Bluefin one not only has the elevator itself be paintable as it goes up, but also goes along with the player, allowing you to keep it up. These can have some interesting jumps, but are more often than not going to leave the routes really predictable. I'd still say they lean more on the fun side than anything else, but you can't get as creative with them as you can with other gimmicks on this list. Next up, number 11, the bridge on Hammerhead Bridge. I know that grades as a whole are a mechanic very common to the series, but having a bridge literally across the entire stage is going to count as a gimmick for me. I think this is essentially a better version of the glass, since you can actually shoot through it, and being able to squid form through it makes it a little bit more easy maneuver-wise. It does help that Hammerhead Bridge, in Splatoon 1 at least, is actually a pretty good stage that works around how this layout works, which means it's pretty clear that if you have a stage built around it, the mechanic can work out quite well. I think it just overall leads to the stage feeling pretty unique and fun to play on. Number 10, the Bridge Spinners, Sturgeon Shipyard. Yeah, they're called bridges on Wikipedia, but I'm not quite sure if that's accurate. These are basically moving platforms that change from vertical to horizontal, which sound kind of nice on paper, but I think they can feel a bit awkward to move on. Vertically, there's not a whole lot there, and there's a bit of jank when the slope changes from being something you can stand on to something you can slide on, as well as desyncing super jumps. It's still definitely more often than not going to be a positive, and I think there's a lot of potential with them that could lead to it being higher, but from what I've seen from it, it just hasn't really been something I remember that much, despite how unique it is. Number 9, Port Mackerel's cars. Welcome to the most exclusive gimmick ever. These are only on the Turf War variant of Port Mackerel, with these two cars that kind of just move between either of the lanes. This is also hard to judge because the layout on port itself makes this gimmick suck since it can completely block narrow hallways. But imagining these cars on a different map where it doesn't block routes could make them more interesting. They're basically a moving platform that you can also hide on the walls on and use it to move from different areas, as well as potentially make separate jumps. I think there's a lot of potential there, and I'd love to see it back, just not with port. Number 8, the Lemuria Hub moving platforms. This one is also a little bit hurt by the stage it's on, as I think the platform spots make the lockouts a little more annoying. But generally, moving platforms can open up more unique opportunities for slower weapons or specials, and compared to the port macro cars, I think these ones are a little bit less hindering since they tend to just be stuck on whatever ground they're on currently, which makes them a little bit more fun to me. There's still some balance issues to work around, of course, but I think for the most part they're kind of interesting. Number 7, Wahoo Whirl's spinning mid. Compared to Wahoo's previous gimmick, I actually like the middle of it. It's kind of a shame how many modes don't have it rotate though. When it spins around, it creates an interesting route going completely around the middle of the map, while also being able to use the fact that it's rotating to good use, either by moving faster or hindering how the opponents move. And with the walls attached to it, there's usually multiple ways in and out of it. I think it's super underrated and ends up being pretty fun to use, honestly. Number 6, Salt Spray Rigs, the Crane. This is also a hard one to judge, because in this case, it's confined only to a tiny area of Salt Spray Rig that's used quite poorly and rarely. However, in a normal position, this would absolutely have use cases. It being on grates gives important downsides, along with having a giant amount of movement, which could be really cool, either being used for certain jumps, stationary subs like Beacon or Sprinkler, or just a spot for backline weapons to use. I think it would have some issues with objective like Rainmaker obviously, but this has to be arguably the most fun one on the entire list. You can do some really silly stuff with this. Number 5, Bluefin Depot's Moving Zone. I think that Splat Zones gets a lot of complaints from more casual players for being a bit more boring of a mode compared to the other objectives. And while I don't necessarily agree with that, I do think having a zone move a little bit is an interesting way to work around it. Obviously you have to be a little careful not to make the zone easy to contest, but Bluefin has a nice example of where it can work, by opening up different routes in the stage, as well as allowing it to be a little bit easier for defenders to be able to get to, because it's technically a bit further away from the attacker spawn. I think that's really interesting, and I would love to see it on a few other stages. Number 4, the spinners on Museum de Alfonsino. I think this is really cool map geometry. I honestly don't have a lot to say. For short range weapons, it gives a lot of unique walls and terrain to fight on, it could open up brand new routes, and it could be nice for stuff like sprinklers or beacons as deployable subs, as well as something for long range weapons to potentially use. Really, I think there's just something there for every kind of weapon and player to use, and they look just plain cool. At number 3, Piranha Pits Conveyors. I think these are really cool for balance. For example, one of the conveyors on this map makes it easier and faster for defenders to get out of spawn, but harder for attackers to push in. That kind of thing is really useful for building maps and making stages a bit more easy for certain teams to move on, while also being interesting momentum-wise. These conveyors really just mesh so well with Splatoon's mechanics that they feel incredibly natural and easy to use. Number 2, the fans on Ancho and Marlin. These go above and beyond though. Platforms that can move horizontally or vertically, allowing for new routes or terrain, which have worked well in 2 separate stages. It's really hard to top these, and there's not a whole lot of downsides. The only thing I can think of is that it does require a little bit of maintenance to keep the fans up, which for some weapons like Explosher, for example, can be a little bit annoying to use, but I think it's a very minor downside. However, there is something I think is better. My favorite Splatoon stage gimmick is the water level changing from Mahi Mahi Resort. I know Splatoon 3 might have hindered perception of how good this gimmick is, but it's insane how much of the stage can change with something like this. This water level dropping can raise or move terrain or introduce entire new ones. Especially look at how Splatoon 1 used this, they got a lot more creative with the changes. Compared to the fans, this doesn't require a lot of maintenance, and having it happen at a certain point of the game based on the timer or objective means that the stage feels a lot more dynamic throughout the match, evolving and changing over time. I could even see this mechanic being enhanced further by dropping multiple times throughout a game, or maybe even raising if it was built properly. With that being said, that's my list of all the stage gimmicks, and for the most part, they're pretty good. There's obviously a few of them that have more negative effects than anything else, but I think making stages more distinct and having something fun to play on is going to be a net positive, especially casually. I personally really enjoy these, and I like that the end of Splatoon 3 put them on more maps. Hopefully, in Splatoon 4, we'll see it more often. Thanks for watching.